Well, Mallory, thank you so much for joining me on the You're Not Alone podcast today. I'm super excited to have you on. And I'll tell you that when I went in to look at some of the topics you wanted to discuss today, I was super excited because I'm like, I want to hear about your story. It sounds very interesting. It sounds like a long, windy road to where you are now. And I'm going to read what you put in for my audience to sort of set the stage. And then I want to hand it off to you. So basically, you said that you were raised in an extremely dysfunctional, abusive household, which caused you to develop OCD. OCD has manifested itself in many ways in your life: an eating disorder, religious scrupulosity, postpartum anxiety. And it's taken a lot of work and self-love to make it manageable. And of course, you go on to say you'd love to share that with my audience, which I really appreciate. So I want to go back to the beginning where you said you used OCD as a coping mechanism while living in a dysfunctional home. First off, how was the household dysfunctional? And then the second thing is how did OCD serve as a coping mechanism?
Right. So growing up in a dysfunctional household, there's sort of hallmarkers of dysfunction. In my case, my household was very dysfunctional and it was coming from generations of dysfunction. So both of my parents came from a very dysfunctional household. For example, my mom's parents, there was alcoholism, addiction, money problems. There was incest, there was, drug abuse, there was time in jail. There was a lot of really negative elements in the household. In my dad's household, his dad had been married like 4 times. There was a lot of really intense religious upbringing and expectations in his household that were like impossible to uphold. There was a lot of physical abuse. And so my parents came together and really should not have gotten married. They got married in the environment where it was kind of like once you hit your 30s, it was like musical chairs. Whoever you were dating at the time, that was who you married. Because in that generation, if you weren't married by 30, you were a loser. And like, what were you doing with your life? So they got married. They didn't really know each other. They each didn't heal from their respective dysfunctional homes. So they got together and it kind of compounded, and they had children together. They kept having children, more children than they were able to take care for emotionally, physically, financially. And all of those hallmarkers from their household growing up really came into my household growing up. So unfortunately, there was addiction. There was multiple types of abuse, physical, financial, spiritual. There was an extreme religious upbringing that could be compared to a cult that I was raised in. There was, there was isolation, there was lack of boundaries, there was conditional love, there was an expectation of perfectionism. There was nothing in my childhood was consistent. We were, constantly moving home, schools, sports. So nothing in my life was in my control at all. And so naturally, it only makes sense that I developed OCD as a coping mechanism. I think a lot of people like to use the word coping mechanism and they think it's always a healthy thing, but OCD was a coping mechanism for me. And when my whole life was out of my control, OCD really acted as a friend to me. And like, I can't control anything in my life, where I live, how my family is, my friendships, my schooling, my sports, but these compulsions and these rituals make me feel safe. So that's kind of how the OCD started in my life.
Yeah. What's it like being sort of raised in like a cult-like environment? That's very interesting to me. What does that feel like? How does that happen? What does the day-to-day look like?
So the very intense religious upbringing that I was raised in was kind of a mixture of traditional Catholicism and fundamental evangelicalism, sorry, long word there. So the thing that really I was indoctrinated into as a woman was purity culture. So purity culture is the belief that literally your worth as a female is based on your virginity, your modesty, your worth to a man, how you present yourself to the world. You literally are prescribed an identity and you need to follow it in order to be good in the eyes of God, in order to get into heaven. So somebody that struggled with OCD, this was probably the worst way that I could have been raised, because the views are extremely black and white. So in purity culture, for example, you are either pure or you are impure. And there's no gray area there. And the church that I was raised in, it promoted sexual activity inside of a heterosexual marriage, and
Yep.
anything outside of that was demonized. And
Mm.
that is, I mean, any type of sexual activity. I'm talking like even masturbation,
Mm.
just the viewing of pornography, any time spent with a boy is viewed as, a sin against God. And my childhood being raised in that environment, at times I would literally balance in my mind and do the math like, okay, I did this. So what do I need to do to even out to get into heaven? What
Mm.
if the rapture is tomorrow? What if God, Jesus, comes tomorrow and I've committed this grave sin by wearing a low-cut shirt or
Mm.
by spending time alone with a boy in a car and kissing him? What do I need to do to even that out, to be good enough in the eyes of God? And in this environment I was raised in, I mean, it would go a step further. We were
Mm.
forced to sign purity pledges as girls, where we literally sign our virginity over to God until marriage. We had to wear purity rings. I don't know if you remember those, like the Jonas Brothers were kind of wearing those, the
Oh,
Disney
yeah.
culture at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So that was something that was definitely going on in the culture, that the church that I was raised in, with the purity rings. And it really, when you numb and suppress somebody's sexuality, it really warps their entire view of the world. And when
Yeah.
I was literally prescribed an identity as a woman to follow, like you are bred to do X, Y, and Z. You need to, keep sweet. You need to, find a husband. You need to do this. You need to not be loud. You need to not be funny. You need to not be aggressive. You need to not have opinions. You need to not be too educated. Like, there was no room to figure out who I was. And there was a fear that developed over who I am as a person, and also just my body
Mm.
developing. So literally, if you're born and raised to believe that like the female body is inherently sexual and
Mm.
evil, and I also believed that it was sinful and dirty, then what do you do when you believe something's bad? You punish it. And I definitely
Mm.
began doing that with my body when I started struggling with an eating disorder. So really, probably the most damage done to me in my childhood wasn't the physical abuse, the financial abuse, the living in a home with people suffering from addiction. I would really say the most damaging thing done to me in childhood was the religious upbringing and teachings that I'm still deconstructing to this day.
Yeah. And was it, I mean, obviously you get that messaging at church. Were your parents also that they were providing?
100%,
Yeah.
100%. So them coming from their own dysfunctional backgrounds, I think that they believed, they, in a way, probably subconsciously wanted to break that cycle, break the cycle of dysfunction, break the cycle of abuse, divorce, all that. But they didn't have either the motivation. They really didn't want to do the hard work that now I am doing.
Mm.
They didn't really want to dig deep in their own trauma. So I think they thought, if we go to church and we live this all-American dream and we're this
Yep.
perfect family and
Yep.
we literally check these boxes that this church tells us and we stay in this prescribed identity, then we did it. So
Mm.
at times in my household, the damage, from purity culture and the teachings in my household were at times even more damaging than the church. In my household, there was extreme homophobic beliefs, racist beliefs. So those
Mm.
things that the church wasn't necessarily outwardly portraying, but was definitely happening in my household.
Yeah. Where, just out of curiosity, where in the country were you raised?
So I was raised in the state of Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay.
but my
Bible
mom
Belt.
was from Arkansas and my dad is from Missouri. So very Bible Belt central. And I'm not sure if a lot of your listeners are educated on what religious scrupulosity is, but it's actually a subset of OCD
Yep.
that manifested itself in my OCD. And it's where the person suffering from OCD has this obsession or rumination based on these religious, morality codes or doctrine that if they don't do these certain things or they don't check these certain boxes, that they are damned or they are viewed, as lesser than, or, whatever their religion deems as bad, they are fearful of that. And man, my OCD just thrived on religion and loved that black and white thinking.
Yeah, and I've noticed that even there, I've had some friends on the podcast who they were born and raised in the Mormon faith, and
Yes, there's a lot of crossover with my
and
experience in that.
they've had so many years of just challenges of unpacking that, and they all have OCD, and so it's like, to your point, when you live in that environment where it's total black and white thinking, you're either this all the way or you're that all the way. There's no room for nuance. I could see how that would just torture somebody. And I was raised in a Christian household. My parents I both identify as Christian, and growing up as a kid, we went to church every Sunday. The one thing I will say is I feel that my parents, it didn't feel like an indoctrination. There wasn't this like heavy push on, you have to act this way, you have to believe this. I mean, the most that we did was go to church and then pray before every meal. And it was like
Right.
a short little 10-second prayer. But I feel like I'm picturing myself in this environment, and I'm just thinking to myself, for you, where do you start to realize that your OCD is being fueled by the religion that you've been raised in?
It really started with when I was in recovery for my eating disorder. So
Okay.
with my religious upbringing, I was also sent to very religious summer camps, one of them being Kanakuk camps, which if you research it, there's a lot of horrible things you will read about the camp. It's just mind-blowing how it was legal to be put in the environment that is Kanakuk camps. It was extremely cult-like. I have a podcast episode where I talk about it. I'm actually part of an anonymous group that's working to expose everything that happened at Kanakuk camps.
Can you talk about it out loud, out of curiosity, right now?
Absolutely.
Can you just give a couple, like, what I now I'm curious, what was it like at this camp?
Right. So Kanakuk, it's actually, it's very overwhelming to research because it's actually a church. I mean, it's fully registered as a 501c3 organization. So they have a lot of different ministries. You may have heard of like K-Life or all these different things that they brand, but their main moneymaker is their children's Christian summer camp. And it's an evangelical economic empire. I was sent there in the early 2000s, and a lot of survivors of Kanakuk camps, all of us are now coming out with our stories of physical, sexual abuse that happened at the camps. All of us have like pretty different experiences. Some of us similar experiences. In my experience, there was attempts to sexually abuse me. So, for example, one of the counselors had wanted me and another young girl to take a shower together in front of counselors. And at that time in my life, I was so self-conscious of my body that, I'm not kidding you, I was willing to die before get naked in front of an adult.
Yeah.
So I had created a workaround, and the girl and I, we stayed in our swimsuits and did the showered together in front of this counselor. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized, that was attempted grooming, that was wrong. But also at this camp, there was very unethical mind control techniques used on us. So, for example, us children, we could never know the time ever throughout the whole camp. We never knew what time it was, what day it was. Our food was controlled. Our access to any information was controlled. We had no access to the outside world at all. So no cell phones, no computers, no even like local news. Everything was controlled. We couldn't even receive letters. We could write them out, but they weren't ever sent out. We didn't have access to basic medical care. We didn't have access to basic hygiene. It was, if you look up Stephen Hassan's BITE model, BITE is an acronym. It stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And it's a wonderful way to analyze if a group or organization is a cult. And if you go through so many things with Kanakuk, it scores very high on the BITE model. So with my experience at Kanakuk camps, combined with my religious upbringing and a few very significant events in my childhood home and my family, I was very fearful of my body as a female developing into a woman, into a sexual being.
Right.
So subconsciously, I wanted to suppress and stop that from happening. So I started to really lean heavily into the coping mechanism that became a full-blown eating disorder. And I completely was formally diagnosed with anorexia nervosa by age 14. So really a tipping point being my experience at Kanakuk camps. I thought subconsciously, if these predators if they like my body as a young girl, then they're only going to like it more when I'm a sexual, full-fledged female,
right.
After puberty. Now I understand that they actually were probably interested in my body because it was the body of a young girl, because they're sick and that's what they were interested in. But I was so terrified to develop and become fertile. Getting your period is something that's very shameful in this church. It's viewed as very dirty, something very secretive. I wanted to stop that from happening as long as I could. I didn't want to become fertile, and, pregnancy, all that's, sex. It's so dirty, shameful, like unspoken of. And
this is evangelical church?
Yeah,
if I'm saying that right?
evangelical church.
That was
evangelical,
the belief system.
And that was the belief system that I was raised in. My parents had some background in the Catholic Church, so there was a little bit of that dabbled into my upbringing, but the main damaging teachings were coming from the evangelical church.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Yes, of course. So I developed a full-blown eating disorder by age 14. My eating disorder got so severe. I try not to say any numbers because since I have had an eating disorder brain, I know what can be triggering to people that are struggling with eating disorders. So I don't like to say, how many calories I wasn't eating or how much exercise I was doing or how much I weighed. But when the time came that I was so physically ill that I required inpatient treatment to physically stabilize me, I was 14 years old and I was about the weight of like a fourth grader.
Wow. Well, did people notice? Like, how did it get to the point where you had to be hospitalized? What are the signs of anorexia? How can people start to notice?
Definitely. So and I just realized that I kind of went on a tangent and kind of, hopefully I explained adequately how the religion kind of led to the eating disorder with the attempted grooming and whatnot that all led to this. But
can I ask one question, Mallory, just real quickly? Do you think that is there, and I'm genuinely just curious, knowing that you have OCD and that religious like scrupulosity was a big part driving that. And all of those belief systems were then swirling around in your head as just a young child. Was anorexia I don't know if you've unpacked this, was anorexia by chance a compulsion to the...
Yes.
Okay.
Because, for example, a lot of religions practice fasting to have mental clarity. They're also, with an eating disorder and OCD and really lots of types of mental illness, a lot of people talk about kind of like a feeling in their mind, like this, not like you're hearing voices, but more like just something pulling to tell you. So in my childhood, I was really told, like, you know, your relationship with God is individual and God will speak to you and he'll maybe tell you something. And he, you know, or people fasting for days for mental clarity. That's something that was really normalized. So I didn't even recognize that what was going on was an eating disorder. I was like, well, this is God speaking to me. And this is my personal relationship with God. So why is it anybody else's business? And I'm fasting and I am doing what I need to do to be pure and mentally clear. And although now I know it was an eating disorder voice, I fully believed that it was the spirit talking to me.
Absolutely. And do you feel that OCD was what was fueling that then too? Like that was...
Definitely. And I think that there's a nature versus nurture aspect here. I definitely am a classic case of the loaded gun theory. So clearly coming from a genetic predisposition for addiction and all of these other mental health issues that were in my family, that was the gun, right? And the bullet was this religion and the dysfunctional household I was raised in, and all I needed to pull the trigger was a couple significant events, and there comes full-blown OCD and an eating disorder. And one of my cousins actually also was hospitalized with anorexia, so it's clearly there's a genetic component there as well. But I lost my train of thought. What were you kind of asking?
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I was curious about, did you think it was a compulsion, which you said that you felt that it was. The question that I asked before that was like, how did it go unnoticed for so long? I just feel like that's...
So I already was in a conventionally small body before I really started struggling with anorexia nervosa. So when I got ill, it came on pretty fast and furious. So it was observed by my parents. Again, in my household, anything mental health related at the time was very shameful. I was viewed as that I was seeking attention or that I was just being difficult. It wasn't viewed as anything. It was being viewed as though this was my choice. Like one day I woke up and said, I would like to struggle with an eating disorder for the next decade of my life. It was definitely viewed as something that I was just doing to be naughty, something that I could snap out of. Medical professionals are the ones that intervened and made sure that I got help. So going to a doctor and them seeing how severely malnourished I was. And at the time, being 14 years old, I was a pediatric patient. So they admitted me inpatient. Where I was raised in Kansas, there wasn't a lot of options for pediatric specialty eating disorder care. So I was actually sent to a hospital about 4 hours away for inpatient treatment. And I thrived in treatment. I did really well. But coming back to that really dysfunctional household, caused me to really struggle with the mental battle for many years. I mean, for example, when my family would come and visit me, one thing my dad said to me was he sees other kids on other floors of the hospital dying of cancer, and I am there because I choose to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, once you know anything at all about mental health, it's just like, there's just so much to unpack there with that statement.
Right.
But just, I mean, I'm sorry that he said that to you. It's a horrible thing to say to somebody. So like, this is the thing about religion for me, because I'm like, I've seen so many people find so much meaning and purpose and fulfillment and happiness in organized and practiced religion. And then I hear stories like this, and it kind of turns my stomach. I'm just like, I don't understand how it gets to this. And like, also, it just, that type of religion is so opposite of what somebody struggling with OCD and anxiety and depression would need to like thrive and feel happy and recover. And so I guess I'm curious, like, okay, so the catalyst, it sounds like, was you were hospitalized at 14. So that was the start of your recovery journey. How do you start to navigate that path from there?
Well, I think for somebody struggling with OCD, religion actually feels great because it has all the answers. So you know where you're going to go when you die. You know what happens to your loved ones. You know it's all written out for you. And literally, in the religion I was raised in, as long as I checked certain boxes, I was safe. That feels great to somebody struggling with OCD. And my opinion with organized religion is I'm fine if religion helps somebody get through their time in this world and brings them peace, as long as they're not hurting anyone. I am an atheist. I am a non-believer. I do not believe in God. I have completely removed organized religion from my life, and I personally have never been more at peace since making that choice. I find enough in this world to be in awe of. I find enough to be in this life excited for. And I'm okay with not having the answers of where we go when we die. And I also do not believe that a God that demands belief in him to escape the eternal fires of hell without providing proof that he exists is a loving God. So even if there was that God and showing up to the pearly gates of heaven, I don't know if I'd want to participate, because nothing has broken my heart more than the church and its teaching. So also just kind of decoupling and me realizing that you can be good without God. You know, we kind of have this morality complex where like Christianity equals good person, and that's certainly not the case. But for me, I definitely was still in that environment, that very religious environment, until age 18, when I finally moved out of my dysfunctional household. I went to university. I made friends that were from all walks of life. I met my husband, and my husband is the first experience of my life where I have experienced true unconditional love. He is the first person that ever loved me properly. And that really led me to become the woman that I believe I was always meant to be. My husband is in the Air Force. He's an aviator in the Air Force. And 6 months after I graduated college, we went to a courthouse on a random Friday, and we got married, and we moved 1,000 miles away from the area I grew up in. I cut off all of my family and completely left the religious cult that I was raised in. And once I had that space and was able to take a step back and get proper treatment and proper therapy, I began to heal. And this year we're celebrating 10 years of marriage, and I have no regrets. So I still was in the religious upbringing for a good amount of time after recovery, but I would say that I really white knuckled my eating disorder recovery till probably age 20. So from 14 to 20, because I was still back in that dysfunctional household, still back with that, dysfunctional upbringing. And it wasn't until I totally broke free, got educated, began providing for myself, was loved properly, and physically got away from the abuse and the control and the mind control of the religious upbringing, that I was able to completely become free. And through proper therapy that is not church sanctioned, so not church therapy, not going to see a priest or a pastor, like actual medical help, getting help, with medications, getting exposure and response prevention therapy. I was just able to come to know myself and realize that religion doesn't have a place in my life, in my heart. And yeah, so that's kind of how I came to leave that situation.
I mean, kudos to you. It's the controlling aspect of religion is something that I've always kept a weary eye on it, because I just feel
Absolutely.
like it feels like it can go there quickly. And I'm being very cautious in my words right now, in terms of what I say about religion, because I have friends that are deeply religious and I love them,
Right.
and they never push any of their beliefs on me, and vice versa. So I don't want to project my reality out there. I will say, though, for the listener, I mean, if Mallory's story resonates at all, I think that it's worth taking a pause and trying to understand. It really stood out to me when you were like, well, for people with OCD, religion feels really good because it gives you all of these perceived answers. It gives you really rigid structure. The existential questions are answered. What is the point of life? What happens after life? But in a sense, it almost feels like, for what I'm hearing from you, is that it can sort of turn into one big compulsion.
100%.
And so, I mean, kudos to you for, what you had to do. The fact that you had to literally move 1,000 miles away, cut off everybody from your past to start over fresh. That is really hard for a lot of people to do. Most people. That is extremely difficult. One question that's like swirling around in my head, because I'm really curious about this. Did you treat the OCD once you broke away and got proper care, not the white knuckle 14 to 18 care, which was church sanctioned? And that's another thing that I actually, Mallory, that you brought up a good point that I want the audience to hear. If religion is a part of your life, at least I'm not saying don't keep it in your life. I don't want to speak for you, Mallory. I don't know your perspective, but I will say that a lot of my religious friends have a tendency of going to, like, I want Christian therapy. And it's like, well, actually, the reason why I'm going to sway you against that is ERP, exposure and response prevention. It's a specific talk therapy to treat OCD, and religious therapy could actually have the potential to make things a lot worse, a lot faster, because you're looking for certainty. And because OCD is the doubting disease and you have all of these questions, even if the priest or the pastor answers them for you, you're still going to be left unsatisfied. And that spiral can get dark really, really quick. So I think you brought up a good point there.
Or there's some gray area where going to a religious type of treatment is, one, you could be at risk for getting treatment from somebody with zero qualifications, zero credentials. Also, I've had, friends in various churches or religious organizations where the underlying tone is that your depression is the devil or your anxiety is the enemy trying to get a hold of you. And we forget about serotonin and dopamine and all of these things, that how it can leave you feeling broken. Like, if I just pray. In the depths of my eating disorder, I prayed for God to please release me of this. Please. I did all the things. I spent time in, extreme deep prayer, and nothing happened. God wasn't there to do that, because I had a disease. I needed medical help. And I really feel for people, because it just leaves you feeling even worse about yourself. Like, what's broken about me? Why am I not, worthy enough? Why is God not answering my prayers? Why is the devil getting me? Why is, the enemy attacking me? That can get into a really dangerous area.
That's exactly what happened with me. The very first therapist I went to, because I didn't know I had OCD. So the very first therapist I went to, she sat me down and I explained to her that I was struggling with these intrusive thoughts. And I remember it distinctly. She was from Texas, and she was like, "Oh, honey, like that's God and the devil fighting inside of you." And I was like, "Wait a second. okay, we need to time this
Right.
up, because that is not the interpretation that I have going on inside of my head. I'm not extremely religious. I would say I'm spiritual. I like to believe
Right.
that we're all interconnected in some beautiful way,
Energy.
and that, yeah, that there's underneath all the fear and all the bullshit and everything else, that our true essence is like love and connection, and that we want to be good people for ourselves and for others. So that's kind of what I vibe with. But yeah, that's funny you bring that up. And now what I know about OCD is like, oh my gosh, if I really subscribed to religion, that would have sent me down a really probably much longer road, because I met with her. I was like, you know what? I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. Let me meet with her one more time. It was more of that. And I was like, yeah, I'm done. I got to find someone else. Because even what she was saying was making things worse. I was like,
It makes
I'm
you
like,
ruminate.
oh, it makes you ruminate. It does. It does. I can't believe that you did that for as long as you did. My OCD symptoms kicked in hard at 22, and within 6 months I was suicidal. So it just
Yeah.
it went fast for me. Did that happen for you at any point, or?
I definitely struggled with suicidal ideation for sure. I think that so much of my childhood was just spent in survival mode that I didn't know anything else. I was constantly in that fight or flight. And that's why I wasn't able to reach true healing until I fully separated, because I didn't even know what life was like outside of that fight or flight. I mean, my household was jumping crisis to crisis and chaos to chaos. And I definitely did reach a point, when I was struggling with an eating disorder still. I was battling OCD and anxiety, and probably at that point, some form of PTSD from my childhood,
like it.
that it was like,
Yeah.
what is the point of going on? Like, this is so exhausting just to survive. Like, this is just getting so exhausting. And luckily I didn't succumb to those thoughts. But I think back to those times and I have a lot of empathy for myself, because now, I'm in a position, I have an amazing husband and my son, and like, this side of recovery is so much better and it is so worth it. And anybody struggling with those thoughts, I just assure you that it is so much better on this side, and it is worth it to recover, and it's possible.
Okay, so let's dive into that. I want to be respectful of your time. Let's talk about that here for a second. So you got out of the religious cult, you moved away, you started treating OCD and anorexia properly. Which one did you treat first? Did treating one help the other, and vice versa? Could you explain that process?
Right. The treating of anorexia is actually the most deadly mental illness. A lot of people don't know that. It's more deadly than, schizophrenia, anything like that, because of the physical elements that anorexia, causes, and the symptoms. And the physical side of it is just a symptom of the mental aspect of it. So the first step is, to get yourself physically stabilized. And I have a lot of empathy for people that like struggle with addiction, because there's a lot of crossover with the behaviors, the secrecy with an eating disorder. But one thing that's different from addiction and an eating disorder is, imagine you still have to partake in your drug 3 times a day, and that's food. It's very, very difficult to retrain the brain. And so the first step was to address that physical aspect and physically stabilize me, get me to a point, where I'm nourished, where I'm healthy, to where I'm even at a point where I can mentally tackle other things. So definitely tackling the eating disorder first. And then when my brain was in more of a safe space, when my body's in more of a safe space, when I'm nourished, I'm properly sleeping, I'm getting joyful movement in my day, I'm having my period, normal things are happening, then I was able to attack that mental side and dig deep into some of the trauma that I had endured in childhood, and where these coping mechanisms came from, why they make sense, to kind of disentangle all of that.
So I'm not super familiar with anorexia. Can you explain to me, like, what is going on in your head when you're struggling with anorexia? Because I think that that's really important for me and the audience to understand.
Right. So there's multiple types of eating disorders. And we didn't know a lot about them in the early 2000s. We kind of the only eating disorders that people would hear about were anorexia or bulimia.
Mm-hmm.
And now we know about orthorexia. We know about binge eating disorder, about binge purge subtype, about anorexia, bulimia. So there's a lots of different types. For me, I was very textbook anorexia. So
Mm-hmm.
I would restrict my food intake to an extreme degree. And physically, that got to the point where, I was so malnourished that I lost my period. You do have to meet the criteria. You have to lose a certain percentage of your body weight. You have to be, physically in that certain realm to be diagnosed with anorexia. Unlike bulimia, it's just more of a behavior. It does have physical side effects to it, but anorexia, they are looking at that, malnourished. You are a certain percentage below your ideal body weight. Maybe you've lost your period, XYZ. So some warning signs of that is really the secrecy around food. Or the making it look like you're eating and you're really not, or the avoiding meal times, or the even obsession around food. So when the human brain, just in general, when it's starved, there's been research studies done of victims after the Holocaust of how, although they weren't struggling with an eating disorder, they were definitely starved. And what the brain will do in a starved environment, that certainly happens to people that are dealing with anorexia. So there's like an extreme obsession around food. At times in the depths of my eating disorder, I would steal food and hoard food. That's something that people do when they're starved. I would cook food for others because I wanted to experience food and smell it, but I didn't allow myself to eat it. I would avoid meal times. I would spend time obsessed with the numbers, reading food labels, tracking calories, calculating calories, looking at everything like an extreme obsession around the numbers, and, trying to get the number that I ate lower and lower and lower, trying to get the number on the scale lower and lower and lower. So those are some red flags with anorexia, and it can get to such an extreme degree that you suffer heart failure. And that's why it can be so deadly.
That was really, really helpful to understand. How do you treat it? Because you said that you had to get stabilized physically. They made you eat 3 meals. I have to imagine you did not want to eat that food. So you were choking down some food. Correct me where I'm not speaking about this properly.
Yeah. So I was, admitted inpatient, and they had to do what was called a reverse diet. So,
Okay.
you start with like kind of a lower amount of calories. So for me, it was like 3 meals, 2 snacks a day. And then slowly you build up those calories. The metabolism wakes up, body functions start to work again, because actually you can't go from a starved body to like feeding them like normal, because the body that'll affect the gut. That there's a lot of things that can be really damaging to. So I was under like the controlled aspect of like a registered dietitian, the doctors, like this was all very calculated. And, it was hard. I had to sit there, eat those meals. But in treatment, other young people were in treatment with me. We would eat family style. We would talk. We would get through it together. And slowly it became more and more easy. We would tackle our fear foods. Everybody struggles with different fear foods. And kind of the rule is like, once it's in, it's in. So like, let's say that your fear food is pizza. You're going to eat pizza now. And it doesn't mean you just eat it once. You're going to have it in your diet throughout, your stay here. And so kind of coming to realize like my body isn't broken, and, eating a normal diet is not going to make the world, catch on fire. It's not going to send me to hell. It's not going to make me be 500 pounds. And also just realizing my body deserves nutrients. There's nothing to fear about the female body. Fertility is something to praise, and just kind of completely reframing my relationship with my body, my relationship with food. That's what I had to do. And I mean, it was the toughest thing I've ever gone through, but I'm so thankful now, especially, being a woman in my 30s, I've done all that work that I'm so confident in my body now. And I have a really healthy relationship with food now that I see some of my peers really struggling because they never did that work. And although they didn't struggle with an eating disorder, they did struggle with some kind of internalized messaging that we all had in the early 2000s, that being skinny is ideal and, diet pills and whatnot. So I kind of see like, wow, the work I did was extremely hard, but on this side, I've grown from it, and it's made me such a better person throughout. And, the way that I will mother my children and kind of, get diet culture out of there, like all of that. I've done that work. I've, healed my relationship with my body, and it's bled over to every facet of my life in a beneficial way.
Gosh, that makes me so happy. I have a million other questions. I guess let me get a time check for you real quick. How much more time do you have? I don't have to ask all my million questions, but I want to pick my
no,
questions.
Yeah, I'm good. Let me track. My husband's coming. Yeah,
Let
I'm
me
good.
see
I'm
where
good. I
I'm
probably got
at.
like 20 more minutes.
Okay. Because this is all like, it's interesting you brought up early 2000s culture. I'm not going to say who, but there was somebody near and dear to my heart who I remember when she came to me and we were in high school, and she was just like, I don't feel beautiful in my body. And it was because it wasn't that stereotypical, super skinny, all that type of body. And now I feel like the culture has shifted where it's like, that's not what people find attractive anymore. It is interesting. I don't want to derail too much. Obviously, the body positivity movement, I think, is really important. Do you think, having gone through what you've gone through, do you think you would know more about this than me? Is there a line that at some point, like the body positivity movement, like is there a line at some point that it's like it's gone too far? For example, if somebody is like morbidly obese but claiming body positivity, and I know this is just an aside, but I'm not an expert in this. You're much more of an expert. I mean, is there a line? Have we crossed it? Is there room for conversation? Can you give me your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are unaware that the body positivity movement actually started with the idea that like your body is beautiful with things you can't control. So for example, if you are a burn victim, if you are a paraplegic, so all of these things, that is what body positivity is surrounded around. So, if you don't fit the, put in a box of like the ideal body of, strong, healthy, you have, no medical issue. Like that's what body positivity is all about. So, like you see a child that's maybe born without an arm, you would really want to raise them in a body positive environment. Like, your body is still strong. Look at how you adapt. Like you want them to still love their body. And that's kind of what it was centered around. And it slowly, over the influence of social media, kind of moved to like fat acceptance, which in general, I don't think that there's anything wrong with loving your body, but wanting to make a change. So absolutely love your body at where it's at now. Even if you are morbidly obese, you should love your body enough to want to make that change. And it just is objectively true that our bodies are not as healthy when we are at a certain body fat percentage, when we are at a certain, level of inactivity. That's just objectively true. So I don't subscribe to the ideal that, just like I wouldn't subscribe to somebody that is in the depths of anorexia and is extremely thin, I also would not subscribe to the body positivity surrounding that. I would say that I hope that they can find love in their body and they want to make a change. But yeah, I do think that there's room for conversation. I do think that it can get dangerous because I do think that in general, in especially America, obesity is an epidemic. It's something that we need to be aware of, especially as parents raising the next generation. So many people struggling with diabetes, like this, all of this is absolutely concerning. Now, you don't need to be fit into that box of super skinny model to be considered beautiful. There's a spectrum.
Yeah.
We all look different. But yes, I agree. I do not think that it's a positive thing that the body positivity movement has become a fat acceptance movement.
Yeah, Mallory, thank you for saying that, because I don't think I can say that, but I know many people, having grown up in Indiana, that died early because of their obesity. And so I'm kind of sitting back like, how long do we just kind of stay quiet and just kind of let this run, because I actually looked up the statistics. Somebody can fact check me. I'm sure there's another study saying something else, but here's what I read, that it's up over 40%. And for me, in this country, and for me, I'm like, that's not how we were. And I love what you said about loving the body, while also, I think that is so critically important. And that's why I want to touch on self-love here in a second. But like, loving yourself, that is a game in and of itself. Like I even kind of look at it separate from like your physical body. That is a mental game that you have to work on, that I'm actually on that journey right now, really working on that. I was a very sensitive boy. I wouldn't say that I have low self-esteem, but I want to like learn to love myself even more and like give myself that permission. So I want to pick your brain on that. But so I think that's one side of it. But like loving yourself and giving yourself enough permission to like also say, I want more for myself, physically. And to your point, it's a spectrum. You don't have to just be the skinny body. Everybody's body type is different. But yeah, I was just curious to get your perspective on that, because I'm noticing, like I saw a Gatorade commercial the other day, and I don't know if you've seen this commercial, but it was like two really fit people and then a woman that was obese. And I was like, that's not the messaging that I thought, that I think like we should be going for. I would hope that we would want people to be healthy. Just like if somebody had OCD, I wouldn't just be like, oh, poor you have OCD, you're doomed for life. I'd be like, okay, you have OCD. That's okay. Now there's some shit that we can do to help you out and get you unstuck from this. And I want you to take that path.
Or if you're struggling from anorexia, not praising you. Look at how skinny she is. She's like on her deathbed. Yeah, let's praise her. She clearly is so disciplined. That wouldn't be happening.
Wow, that is an excellent example. And that is actually such a like, they're correlated, right? It's the opposite spectrum on both sides. So I love that. So I know we went off tangents. I was just curious to get your opinion there. So the way that you treat anorexia is, it was in a group setting. They stabilize you. Do they start to work on your mentalities then? Do they start to change the way that you look at food? How does that work?
Right. So a big thing is removing morality from food. So not viewing food as good or bad. It's just food. And also understanding that food doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be okay. So yeah, a big thing is all of us that were in treatment, for whatever reason, our minds had, attached certain foods as good, certain foods as bad. And so doing that exposure of eating those fear foods and seeing that nothing bad happens, and repeating and repeating and repeating. And it was terrifying, but also once your body physically gets to a more healthier place, like literally when you're struggling with anorexia, I mean, there's fat cells in our brain, and those fat cells start to decrease when you're struggling with anorexia. So some of your thought patterns don't even make sense. I mean, every single part of you is dulled. Like it's awful. So getting yourself nourished is the first step. And then being able to be like, okay, now that I'm not in a starved body, I can look at this a little bit more, rationally and attack this. And I can see that my body's responding. It's not broken. I'm, achieving more physical health. Where did all of these thought patterns come from? Why am I using food as a coping mechanism to feel safe? And so kind of I've never met somebody with an eating disorder where it's the exact same story or it's the exact same habits or compulsions. All of us, our minds created its own little eating disorder experience. And the medical teams that luckily were educated, in my experience, were really good about diving in and understanding and tackling. And, they had so much experience that they knew the different habits. And again, I try not to say so much about those habits because it can almost come across as tips to somebody that may be struggling. But getting in an environment where it wasn't viewed as shameful and I was able to truly open up about everything, habitually that I was doing, the compulsions, the rituals, everything surrounding food. And them coming from a point of education and being able to break all those down.
Okay. That sounds really helpful and beneficial. So then after that, was it, you said you did exposure and response prevention. So was that to tackle OCD next once you'd been stabilized?
Yes. So, and that was, I mean, when you tackle food at home, it's a lot different than going out to a restaurant. Like, so it's kind of like you keep leveling up and leveling up and leveling up. And, now I'm at a position where I feel like I'm fully leveled up. Like I went through a pregnancy and I didn't relapse into anorexia. I breastfed my son. I don't count calories. I practice intuitive eating. I'm a
Mm,
power lifter. I can deadlift over 200 pounds. Like
nice.
I have a great, healthy relationship with food now. I do not and I will not ever negate any food groups. So that might be controversial to some people, but for example, I will never practice veganism, keto. I'll never participate in a cleanse. I will never partake in any diet pills. For
Mm,
me, my eating disorder brain, I just know that I have been so vigilant about my recovery, and I do not want to give that eating disorder brain even the slightest chance to latch on to something.
yes.
So, but I also think, isn't this the goal? Isn't this what everybody wants to reach? They're strong, they're healthy, they have a great relationship with food. So I'm not willing to mess that up.
Yeah, I love the how you've been able to reframe everything into like a much healthier light, and there's room for nuance. It's not this or that. It's like I'm healthier, I'm feeling stronger. I'm all food groups are welcome here. What's intuitive eating?
Intuitive eating is so you don't track your macros, you don't track your calories, you don't negate certain food groups. You truly eat, when you're hungry and stop when you're full. So I don't have a prescribed like 3 meals, 2 snacks per day. Like some days I'm eating 3 meals, 1 snack, some days 2 big meals, 1 snack. Like I'm really just listening to my body and
Mm,
it's working. If some days I'm just ravenous, I lean into that, eat more carbs, more fats, more protein, whatever. I don't restrict myself when my body needs it. And I mean, I also weigh myself maybe once or twice a year, and
mm.
my weight doesn't fluctuate that much. So clearly, listening to our bodies, we did it for a millennia before we knew about calories, and it worked. So that's what I practice now.
That's really helpful, Mallory. Thank you for sharing that. The last thing I want to touch on quickly, and I'll let you be on your way, is just the self-love. It seems like there's some little phrases here and there that I've picked up from you that makes me seem like you've been intentional with this work. Have you been intentional with cultivating self-love? Um, and if so, what has that looked like for you?
Oh, 100%. I've been very intentional with cultivating self-love. And for me, because of the situation that I was raised in, I have literally had to reparent and remother myself.
Mm,
So I have had to cure and, love on and be there for little Mallory for so many situations where my parents weren't. They didn't protect me. They put me in dangerous situations. They, prescribed me an identity, like all these things. So I have had to take a position of remothering myself, being gentle with myself, being empathetic towards myself, like I would and I am with my own child. And I
mm,
encourage people to do that. Something that was really helpful in my recovery was in my mirror in my bathroom, I would put up a picture of little Mallory. So me when I was a little girl.
mm.
And when I would think these horrible thoughts about my body, I would say, would you say that to her? Because that's what you're doing right now. And that helped me reframe and really show up for who I needed when I was a child.
I really like that. I've heard that done before, and it just kind of brings a smile to my face because I think that sounds really beneficial. So you would basically put the picture up in the mirror, and you would say, "Would you say this to this person?" And then you started to become more conscious of the negative self talk, and then would actively work to. How would you actively work to change that? Was it changing your thoughts? Was it changing your actions?
Yeah, so kind of we talked about body positivity, and when you have like body dysmorphia or a really negative relationship with your body or food, you don't just go from body negativity to body positivity. On the
Mm,
way there, there's what's called body neutrality. So I had to really practice body neutrality. So if I would have, negative thoughts around food or my body or just me as a person or whatever, I would just neutralize them. Like if I felt like, oh my God, my stomach feels so fat today, it's like my stomach is not like it's just a stomach. It doesn't make me good. It doesn't make me bad. It's not causing anybody pain. It's not, I'm not giving it an identity. I'm not letting it ruin my day. It just is a stomach. I also happen to have a uterus. My stomach bloats. My stomach does this. It's a normal human body. It just is what it is. And then
Yeah.
kind of on that way, just like that cognitive behavioral, like retraining those thoughts, reframing, repetition after repetition after repetition, I was able to find myself on more of a body positive side of being like, look at what my thighs just did. They freaking leg pressed 300 pounds, So you kind of slowly, you see these little gyms pop in where you're like, oh my gosh, like I have found my way into body positivity after taking that pit stop at body neutrality.
Okay. I like that. That's really helpful to understand. I guess in addition to that, kind of the phased approach, the picture of yourself as a kid, is there anything else that was helpful that you think my audience could benefit from?
Definitely plugging in and connecting with other survivors, other people that have struggled with similar disorders, diseases, anything, mental health wise that you have, because I think so many times anything mental health related, we gaslight ourselves into feeling like we're crazy and we're the only ones. And in the early 2000s, there was, a lot of shame surrounding eating disorders, and there just was, OCD on the TV was really made out to be a certain way. Like it was all about
Yeah.
contamination OCD, or, you must be like this. And so you just lead yourself to feel like I must just be crazy to have these intrusive thoughts. And there's no way I want to voice this. They'll put me in a insane asylum. They'll, lock me up, throw away the key, whatever. But then when I started connecting with other people and they're like, literally, I go through the exact same thing, it humanized the whole experience. It made me realize that I'm normal. I'm not broken. So yeah, I mean, that's what led me to create my social media account, to be able to, instead of just taking all these experiences and internalizing them, to kind of put them out into the world and be like, hey, if you struggle with this too. And I've had so many people that have connected with me and been really vulnerable with me and thankful for me sharing my story and whatnot. And that's just been really powerful, just to connect just with the most random people and been like, hey, I dealt with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. There's so much power in community, and that's why the name of the podcast is You're Not Alone, because
Exactly.
we do have a tendency to gaslight ourselves. And this is normal. These are things that people struggle with, and we can get through it together. So I really, really appreciate you coming on the podcast today, Mallory. I feel like I learned a lot. I know my audience is going to learn a lot. I know that there are going to be people that listen to this and this is the message that they needed. Where can people connect with you?
Yeah, definitely. So mainly you'll find me on Instagram or TikTok. That's at Mallory Like Calorie, Mallory, Mallory, the word like and calorie. You can also email me, mallorylikecalorie@gmail.com, and I'd love to hear from you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today, and really just appreciate the message that you're spreading.
Definitely. And thank you so much for having me on. And I love what you're doing.
Thank you.